So it's the early 2010s, and Silicon Valley is in a long-term romantic relationship with building a community for every product. But the late 2010s come around, and Silicon Valley kicks out community building for the hotter, cheaper, faster, paid advertising for growth. But now, the X is back in town, and she had a glow up like never before. So I wanted to understand from an expert himself, somebody who spent the past 2 decades building the biggest communities for some of the best companies out there, like Microsoft, Ubuntu, GitHub, Airbnb, and answer one question. If AI commoditizes product building, can communities be the real moat a company survives on?
The problem is that the word community tends to have a little bit of a sour taste with a lot of founders because they think of it as, you know, some fucking boring forum with a bunch of nerds hanging out in it that's very transactional.
And at the end, he tells me how one of his biggest community successes was actually a loss. So let's get into it. Jono, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I think you're probably the first YouTuber to show up on the podcast. So that's always a breath of fresh air for me.
What an illustrious honor. And also the word YouTuber is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't generally get into professional history, so on and so forth. But I do want to point out, you've spent close to 2 decades building your own communities for other products like GitHub, Ubuntu, so on and so forth. So I think this episode is directed towards people who want to understand community building more deeply. And really my first point of conversation for you was going to be, why is Silicon Valley in a situationship with community building all of a sudden? Because we forgot about it about 6 years ago because paid advertising became really cool. And now that we've realized AI can commoditize it really quickly and at a pace never seen before, people have started to talk about IRL events. They started to talk about branding. They started to talk about content. And most importantly, they've started to talk about community. So the question really is, when you talk to technical founders who are based in the Valley, their thinking is very input-output driven. Like, I put X in and I get Y out, is a observation I've made personally. I would love to know, when you talk to them about the value of community and why, for a technical founder who's obsessed with the product and getting 10 features out in a week, suddenly takes a step back and understands community is extremely important and I need to put my time and resources towards that.
Yeah. I mean, I think a founder who is saying, like, I want to put these resources into something and I want to get a return on it, I think every founder should be doing that. And I think that's the right way to run a business. But I think that founders, especially technical founders, they intrinsically and intuitively know that a large proportion of companies that are successful in this space have built a really deep relationship with the technical audience, with developers, with SREs, with now it's like forward deployed engineers, things like that. And that's about building a community in some form. The problem is that the word community tends to have a little bit of a sour taste with a lot of founders because they think of it as, you know, some fucking boring forum with a bunch of nerds hanging out in it that's very transactional in nature. And that you typically have to hire a community manager. And that is a role that sometimes has mixed reviews in founders' minds because they're like, you know, I've heard stories about community managers. They kind of come in and they create a lot of content. They do this, they do that, and the other, but I don't see any actual tangible value that gets tied to the business. So what I always say to founders is, one is that a community manifests in multiple different ways, right? It does not have to be a bunch of people into a forum. In fact, 9 times out of 10, we actually recommend against that, right? Because the people who go into forums and Discord channels and stuff like that are usually 20% of your most active members. We've ran the numbers on this. It's usually the most active 20%. The broader 80%, you can engage with them with a community, but it will be through events, it'll be online content and engagement, right? It won't be that kind of forum or Discord experience. And that when you do this work, you should be measuring tangible results and expecting a return on that. And you know, there's been this misnomer in the community professional space that, well, you can't really measure the ROI of community. That's bollocks. You can measure the ROI of community. So, you know, I think it's all about accountability.
So let's say there's a startup founder who wants to spend $100K in getting really active users. So they're looking at both acquisition and activation. as their goals over the next 3 months. And now they have to choose whether to put that money into paid advertising or building a community. What would your recommendation to them be if those two are the KPIs they're trying to hit?
When we work with people at my company, State Shift, we do basically we specialize in go to market for technical audiences, right? And it's like the full life cycle. It's not just community is one piece that we do. We look at all of these different channels. Like you've got like blogging and social media, paid ads, community platforms, whatever else. Each of those different channels serves a different purpose, right? So we broadly break it down into paid media and then organic media. And paid ads and stuff like that are generally good for spikes. So influencers, ads, stuff like that is a great way of guaranteeing traffic, but it tends to be fairly short-lived in nature, right? So if you depend on that, then you're basically always on the teat for, funneling a bunch of money into that to make sure that you can generate those outcomes, which then turns the conversation to return on ad spend. And what we see is that sometimes then people can be tempted by the dark arts of shitty kind of like tactics and ways of engaging online to generate the return on the ad spend. The organic way, which is communities and blogging and social media and stuff like that, takes much longer to gestate and to generate results, but it's a much more stable foundation for a business, right? So we honestly recommend a mix of both. Like I was talking to a founder yesterday, for example, where they've got a new AI product and it's a really great product. And what we're doing in parallel is we're hiring some influencers to get that spike in traffic. And the main reason why we're doing that is because we want to generate a bunch of traffic that goes to their website so we can test the activation, right? So when someone lands on the website, do we get them to actually using their product and getting some kind of outcome within 5 to 10 minutes, right? That is the bright line test. Now, there's a whole part of our model where we optimize that. But to test those optimizations, you need to drive traffic to it, right? And if you're doing organic, then you can't guarantee the traffic. So that's where things like influencers and ads are a great way of driving the traffic to test the activation. But in parallel, we're putting in place things like writing blog content that's optimized to get into the LLMs, like with GEO, where we're focusing on LinkedIn engagement with personal accounts, not brand accounts, and stuff like that. So to us, like each of these channels serves a very, very different purpose. But in the early stages of a company, the main thing you need to do is to validate that your activation works. Like I see so many companies where all the channel selection and doing the channel work is really sexy and fun. The boring, eat your vegetables, make sure your tie's on straight stuff is the activation. And that has to work because otherwise you get all of this traffic that comes to your site, but if you can't activate them, then nothing happens.
So let's talk about the community angle. And I know you've said that a lot of communities are centered around the product. Like that is where the conglomeration of people essentially takes place. So when you look at that, I also look at other examples of companies that have done it brilliantly, not centering it around the product, because especially at the startup stage, the product has rough edges. It's not really figured out. You're having active conversations to figure out really what the ICP is and really what pain point you're trying to hit. So a lot of early stage startups go to, let's make the founder the center of the community, right? Use his likeness and get people to like that and get engaged with him, or do it around the brand and, doing events or meetups or just being there in person, maybe doing guerrilla marketing to get people excited and get them recognition around the name, possibly build a community around it. So product to me, especially now, because of how commoditized it's become with AI, seems like a choke point for the community. So when you talk to teams right now who are in hyper competitive environments where their product can be duplicated tomorrow and they want to build a solid foundation with the community, but they have to center it around the product, how do they solve for this issue? And if you had to pick between product, founder, or brand centric, which one of those are you recommending right now?
I think it really depends on the company. This is probably a bit of an unsatisfying answer because I think it really does depend. So I'm going to take a step back because I think one of I'm going to kind of go back to something I mentioned a little bit earlier on, which is the word community, as people tend to think of it in the tech world, especially. Most people tend to think of it as like a group of people who have assembled in a place digitally, and they are passionate, they're engaging, they're answering each other's questions. It's like an interactive fan base around what I'm doing. And that's great. And that is, to me, the third level of community building, right? that's where you kind of want to get to. You essentially, you start out with consumers, then you have champions, and then you have contributors or collaborators, right? So if we look at the community experience, if you throw people into that environment and they're brand new, most people will reject it and they'll leave because it's just too much. And most humans just don't tend to gravitate to that. Like, I have been doing this for 30 years and I don't hang out in a lot of Discord channels or forums either. And the ones that I do are because I have a very specific interest that I'm focusing on. So to me, when I unpack the community experience, what it really is it's bringing people together to learn and grow together. And then what you do is you apply different levels of friction depending on where they are in the journey. So if they're brand new, let's say you've got Josephine blogs as the CEO of a company, and she has got this new AI product that's out there. The first thing I would do at the consumer level will be to try to get her to a piece of content that was formulated from a bunch of other people who are using the product that are showcasing how they're using it, right? So she can consume and benefit from those other people, right? The next level will be getting her into an online event, which is not a webinar because webinars suck. It's where people come together and they interact, they engage, and they collaborate together. And then when you keep this flywheel going, eventually, when some people will have this massive amount of passion and focus, and what they will do is they'll create content, they'll go and speak about you, they'll join brand ambassador programs and things like that. Now, the question about whether you anchor it to the product or to something else really significantly depends on the market that you're in, right? So and it also depends significantly on your budget, right? So if you've got a relatively small budget, you should anchor it to the product, right? Because building non-product communities is risky, it's expensive. And while you can develop a larger audience, where those kinds of communities tend to struggle is when, Josephine, she decides she's going to build, like, instead of a community around my AI product, I'm going to build a community around just, inference, AI inference in general. So she forms this community, a ton of people join, and then she suddenly starts shilling her product into that community. That leaves a really bad taste. So even if you build that community, which is, it's not specific to your product, it's more around a profession or a subject matter area, the level in which you can expose your product and what you do in your company is firewalled off to a certain degree. People will learn about it primarily by association, right? It's how you show up. And so that's the calculus. And for some markets, it makes no sense to do that for those more general areas. But for some, it makes a ton of sense. So it really depends on kind of what your business is.
I love how it was an answer and a non-answer at the same time.
All right.
But if you had to, and let's get a little bit more specific with it, and because what I'm trying to understand is, especially with AI products at the moment, or in fact, SaaS products are trying to be AI products at the moment, right? There is the sense that they feel less and less confident in the idea of the product being the linchpin that people are gravitating towards. That's why you see a lot of money being spent on founder-led marketing, even employee-led marketing, team-led marketing. Lovable did a brilliant job at it. Corgi did a brilliant job at it. And they're looking for other ways to make sure that, yes, the product's important and you're going to use it, and making it a delightful experience is great. But at the same time, that's not enough, because our experience is great today, which can be replicated tomorrow. So for an early stage founder who's in the AI sphere, let's say, hyper competitive environment, product commoditization is a reality today. And they really had to pick, what am I putting my chips down on? Is it red or black, right? So if I'm putting my chips down on it, what direction am I trying to go in? Because I have another question related to that, but I'll come to that. But I do want to understand, for that specific use case, where are you sending?
If you're an AI company and your product is at risk of being replicated, then I'd focus your effort on making your product less at risk of being replicated. That's the most important thing, because you're dead in the water unless you have a solid moat around your product. A community marketing is not going to save your product, like if it can be easily replicated. Now, there are things that are within your control and the things that are outside of your control, right? That's where I would start. But I actually don't think we're seeing people pulling back from the idea of product-centric communities. In fact, that's where the vast majority of communities tend to be built, that are driven by a founder. Right. We see communities forming in subject areas where somebody creates a community and it's unrelated. Their company might be a participant in it, but it's not driven as a marketing initiative within their company. They're just doing this to bring people together. And I think there is some value around that. But I think if you are hiring somebody to do marketing, I would recommend that you focus it on your company and on your product, because that to me is where you're going to get the most where you're going to get the most leverage from it. But the key thing is you've got to differentiate the experience, right? So I'll give you an example: GitHub versus Atlassian, right? So I think most people would agree that GitHub captured the minds of developers. Atlassian, good people, plenty of money, decent products, but GitHub won in that regard. One of the reasons why GitHub won is because they built a belief system around GitHub, not just the product, but also around the people who work at GitHub, that we are your tribe, we are your people, right? So they built very much a community around the product. But what they did is they showed up with great content, with events, with collaboration in a way that didn't just showcase GitHub, but it showcased the principles that everybody holds dear, right? So most developers, most engineers believe in the value of the pull request. They believe in the value of like people collaborating on code bases together. And as a general rule, code should be as open as possible, either within a company or outside of that with open source. Those principles manifested in everything that GitHub did. Atlassian didn't do that, right? So GitHub were able to build a very successful community around GitHub because of the way and the taste and the tonality in which they did it. Now, they could have created a community around software engineers, and I actually don't think that would have been the right strategy for them. And if we look at Figma, Notion, tons of companies have done the same thing. So I would actually primarily recommend focusing on the product.
Lovely. So let's talk about, the technical audience and what a developer means today. So for a lot of technical products, even like hyper technical products, I think about some examples on that side, which are now being used by a non-technical audience as well, and they are diving headfirst into it. So the whole notion of, okay, there's a certain level of knowledge and education you believe your audience has, who's trying to use your product, is now divided, is not as clear maybe, where you might say, okay, now non-technical people can dive headfirst into it. They can be a part of the community. They can start contributing, and they can also become a large part of where the product goes, the company goes. So I know you talk about the idea of like a community ICP, like this is the type of person you're trying to solve for, and these are the pain points you're trying to solve for. But now because of AI and vibe coding and so on and so forth, that problem sphere has been expanded, where a non-technical audience now can also be a part of that same problem set that a developer was. So when a company, let's say, although that's a really hard thing to do, let's say they solve for acquisition of the right kind of people who have similar pain points. But within that process, they get a lot of non-technical members as well. And now they're trying to decide, is this my community ICP or not? What did they do in that sense?
So let's say you're an observability company, right? That you're Datadog, right? And you sell observability tools to DevOps and to developers and whatever else. But now, because people can vibe code, you've got non-technical people who want those tools. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah.
So,
but not just using the tools, being a part of the community.
Right.
And then they're asking questions, they're being active. Yeah. From that angle.
So I think I would break this. It's a really interesting question. I'll break this into two different pieces, because what I'm seeing is that the majority of like developer-centric companies where it's a product community, it's focused on a product, it's focused on a technical audience. Good example is Vercel. Their AI hasn't really shifted significantly non-technical people coming to those companies. It still is generally it's that audience. Now, the scope of what they're delivering as a product is shifting, right? So Vercel historically would be focused on deployments very specifically for a particular type of audience, right? And now with vibe coding, people want to deploy vibe coded apps, right? So absolutely, it's broadening out. But as a general rule, I think most of these companies are still very much focused on they know who their economic buyer is, who their technical users, and they're tending to focus on that. But the other side of the fence here is where you get communities. A good example of this is Ubuntu. When I was running the community team there, we had a ton of engineers, right? People would be building software, packaging software, whatever else. But we also had people who just really loved Ubuntu. And they wanted to help, but they weren't developers. So they wanted to create content and they wanted to do marketing and stuff like that. And I think it is really important to make sure that you provide that breadth of ways in which people can participate. But I find that tends to be primarily in the larger open source projects. To me, there's a big distinction between a community and a movement, because a community is like, you can build a community around almost anything, right? You can build anything that more than one person has got an interest in, you can build a community around. But a movement is where the formulation of whatever brings everybody together has an ethical component where people feel part and parcel of moving a broader sea change in humans in the right direction. So Firefox is a good example. Back in the early days of the web, Microsoft were trying to basically make it proprietary. Firefox sprung out from Mozilla. People who contribute to Firefox didn't just feel like they weren't just interested in the browser. They were interested in the web being open. So there was a reason behind it. It's the same thing with Ubuntu. For us, it wasn't just the software. People felt like this is an open source is what we're really a part of, and this is the flag that I'm putting into the ground. I find that you see much more of the technical, non-technical balance there than with pure founders who are building companies and selling to technical people.
But let's say and might be hypothetical also, right? But I think I look at my own case study. I'm a marketer. I've been doing marketing for 8 years. Luckily enough, I started my career doing some bit of programming. So I knew my way around code. But when I jumped into AI, web coding, and building the kind of tools I built, I think I've built 12 tools, all of them deployed using VPS, using
Nice.
vector databases, using RAG memory. I mean, these are things that I would have never, one, understood, second, been interested enough to jump into it. But now, even like you gave the example of Vercel, right? There are a ton of people who are using Vercel. Even let's take Claude Code, for example, like, the linchpin of what was sold as a developer CLI, this is going to be your primary tool that you use for programming, so on and so forth. I know more people who use Claude Code who are non-technical than that are technical. Obviously, the volume of usage is going to be different on both sides because there is a learning curve. But still, there is a large portion of that audience that's going into it. And Anthropic might have never predicted for the fact that, this is what we're trying to do. Now, the challenge, however, in a case study like this, and I think this is only going to get propagated more and more and more and more as we go forward, because now you have mom and pop software. That's an idea that gets floated around where anybody can build anything for their own specific use case. So when, let's say, we go into a future which seems likely at the moment, and a company is trying to decide, when I'm trying to communicate to the people that are commercially, linked to my company, it's not just going to be developers, but non-technical people as well. So when they're communicating to those people, should they still stick to the idea that, okay, no, I don't care if non-technical people use my product, I'm going to stick to my guns and talk to developers only? Or should they look at a slight middle ground, or maybe expanding or making it simpler and easier for the non-technical audience to latch onto it as well?
Yeah. So so first of all, I completely agree with you that the landscape of how these products are being used is shifting. The way I would characterize it, in my opinion, and this is like one part of a broader, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm going to make an appeal to your audience here today. This is something I've been sharing / ranting at people. I think that the community that you attract with like putting aside the broader open source projects, like for a company with a founder, with a product, the community that you attract is always generally going to be a reflection of who your product is designed for. Right. So if you are railway, the kind of people who are going to be attracted to a railway community are going to be the people who are using railway to deploy software. Right. And if railway is primarily anchored towards professional operations people who work for companies, you're going to get those kinds of people. I don't think you're generally going to attract a lot of non-technical people in that capacity. However, I think the point that you're making here, Anav, is that the role and the scope of these tools is shifting, right? That I agree with you. There are a ton of people who are now coding who have never had any background in software engineering, but they're coding, and that's awesome. And I'm really excited by this. Like, there are some kind of like technical people who are quite snooty about this. I think those people are stupid. Like, this is brilliant. We should be, the ability for people with agency to be able to build and manifest the things that they see in their heads. I think we should be all in favor of that. My 13-year-old son is building apps, right? Which I think is awesome. The thing that I think is going to be super interesting is that there are basically two camps today, right? There's the mum and pop types, right? And that's going to be, and from what I can tell, the consumers have basically all decided that ChatGPT is where it's at. That's where the brand recognition is. Everybody uses ChatGPT. And then for the real like tech people who are in tech companies, a lot of the kind of people who will be watching this have all basically decided that they're using Claude or Gemini. I think there's a middle ground, and this is where my little rant comes in. There is a middle audience that has been underserved, and that audience is me. And what I mean by that is, in my company, StateShift, we've built out like an agentic control plane platform. We built it with LangChain and LangGraph, and it's been a game changer for my team, right? I have a background in software engineering. I used to be a developer, pretty bad developer many years ago, but I'm not a professional engineer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm certainly not an operations person, right? So I want something, I'll use a bad analogy here, right? If the mums and pups are being served by Wix, right, which is brilliant, point and click, off you go. And then the professionals are being served by like building full stacks to build software. What I want to see is Webflow, right? That middle ground that makes it easy to build a serious application, a serious website in this analogy that serves this middle ground of people. And part of the reason why I think this is important is the people who fall into my category, like I'm not JP Morgan Chase, but I'm not someone vibe coding a calorie calculator, is this audience that I'm in, we have buying authority. We're not going to churn as much because we understand the technology. And I think there's a huge opportunity to sell to that audience. I think there's a huge opportunity to serve that audience, and that audience will attract, I don't think it'll attract necessarily super non-technical people, but I think it'll attract an amalgamation of a sliding scale of technology familiarity, right? So but I don't think that will be as much of a sell. I don't think it will probably be railway. I think it'll be a narrower type of company that is going to be more focused on that. Is my thesis.
So it seems like there is almost a new ICP that's underserved that nobody's talking about. And I
Yeah.
absolutely agree with you, because there are a couple of companies that are technical products who have nudged towards, hey, there's a larger user base here. Instead of just talking to developers, maybe we could talk to them and have a blue
Yeah.
ocean in
I'll,
front of
I'll
us.
give I'll give you a concrete example of this, right? Like Lovable. Lovable is, I think, a fabulous product. It's great. It's great for vibe coding. I would not host anything on Lovable, right? They've had security issues in the past. So what I think is the right outcome here is you vibe code whatever you want on Lovable. You save that code into GitHub, and then you have a product that takes that code from GitHub and deploys it easily without you having to know about setting up cores and all this kind of stuff, right? So you give the autonomy for the person to be able to build the software, but you also enable the deployment and the hosting, the security around that to be as easy as possible. That to me is the missing link. And I think this is going to be a huge market of people, because the problem is that we're seeing is the huge companies who are deploying AI to developers. There's 3 companies that we work with who've deployed all of the AI out into their engineering teams, and they've got sub 5% usage. Like there's a lot of developers who just don't want to use this stuff in larger organizations, and they can get away with it, right? Whereas this middle stage, people are not, I'm not so sure about AI. They're running towards AI. And that is a great opportunity as well to build that community around it. So
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we sidetracked into a different discussion altogether. I was going to come back to community. But
yes.
I think a big question in a lot of founders' minds right now is when it comes to building out the community, and you're building it out almost piece by piece. You've said this multiple times, that having somebody dedicated, like a community manager or somebody that leads community specifically, that's what they think about day in, day out, right, is extremely important. And that's the kind of people
Yeah,
you work with.
definitely. Yeah.
So there are founders, frustratingly so, that think, okay, what do I need to do? Okay, I need to have a Discord. Okay, and what do I need to do? I need to moderate. Okay, what else do I need to do? I need to talk to them every day, make small talk with them, right? Can I not just build out an AI agent that takes in, that messages them every 8 a.m. in the morning, 8 p.m. at night, does small talk with them, does all of these pieces, moderates the community, makes sure no funny business is going on around in Discord, and I don't need a community manager. Now, obviously, at a certain scale, you definitely do. But like I said, like we've spoken about, there is a middle ground where a founder feels comfortable enough, especially the technical ones, where they think, oh, I'll just build a agent for that, and then that'll manage my community, right? Why do I need a community manager? So when you talk to founders like that, and I know it's a widely acceptable preconceived notion, even as false as it might be, when you talk to them, how do you convince them, like, no, like that's wrong? It has its advantages, but you're thinking the wrong way. Give me an
Yeah.
example. Maybe tell me a story of a founder who might have said this to you.
So we're not seeing yet I haven't yet seen a founder who wants to kind of automate a lot of that kind of community building yet. I think it's going to happen. I think you're 100% right, Arnav. The way I would, if somebody came up to me today and said, like, this is what I want to do, like, what do you think I should do? The way I would frame it will be this, is that the beating heart in a community of what makes a community special is a sense of human connection. It's a sense of belonging, that you're with your people, that you're with your tribe, right? And that experience is undermined when you break the trust that it's driven by humans, right? So I think if you've got agents that are operating within a community, that are providing value, and it's known that it's an agent. It's known that it's there to help and with the overall community experience of the humans. No problem whatsoever. I think I would lean into that. I think when you deploy agents that pretend to be humans, that's a problem. First of all, you're a shithead for doing that because you're faking it. But secondly, it doesn't work because the minute somebody discovers that, and it's easy to, we all know how to tell AI. The minute somebody thinks that, then every future action that you take will be judged with suspicion. So don't do it because it will kill trust. And trust is easy. It takes years to build and it's easy to lose. The way in which we approach this and what I would guide this founder will be to say, like, use your own judgment around how you deliver the community experience. And I would always, I'm obviously biased when I say this, building communities is hard, it's complicated, it's weird. Hire somebody, whether it's us or whether it's somebody else, to come in and help you do it. Use human judgment to decide strategically what you do, and then use AI to optimize the execution and the delivery of that, right? So for example, I think having the founder show up in the community and interact and engage with people, absolutely, that's important. It shows a level of touch and level of taste within that founder. But building, vibe coding a community app and creating agents where a community member can go to the agent and say, hey, I want to try and do this particular thing, and the agent will help them out, 100% do that, right? So I don't think it has to be AI or no AI. It just has to be AI in the right shape and format within that community. And it should never be faking humans, and it should never be building trust. The AI should never build trust. It should be humans that build trust.
You keep talking about this factor of like community building is a weird thing to do, and communities themselves are like,
Yeah,
there's a certain level
very
of,
strange.
yeah, it's a strange activity that people don't understand because it seems almost abstract. If you had to put your finger on what that weird thing is, and if a company wants to build that sense of feeling, because that is what most great communities have within themselves. And I always go back to like Reddit subreddit examples of, there are some wild communities on there. Like there are subreddits on topics that you would never think about. So
Definitely true.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like if a company wants to build that feeling of, yes, it's sense of belonging, yes, it's engagement, yes, talk to them, answer their questions, answer their pain points. All of that is great. But I want to really know, what is that weird thing that, it's almost intangible, abstract. Nobody can put their finger on it. But when they have it, it's fantastic. And that's when you have a really engaged community.
Yeah, I think what makes it strange is more the tactics and the execution and the sequencing of what you do. I think for most people, and I say most but not all people, most people kind of feel it in their bones what a good community experience is, right? Like when you feel part of something, when you feel part of a group, you feel like if you leave, people will miss you. When you feel a sense of personal connection to people, we all experience that in some shape or form, with our families, with our friend groups, whatever. Not everybody experiences that. There are people on the spectrum who find it much more challenging to discern those human signals, right? And I think where people get confused is like they feel it, and part of the reason why people feel attracted to building communities is they're like, I want that. It's almost like a romantic feeling that you want to ingest into your users. Where they find it strange is like, how do I architect that? Because it almost feels like an abstract, metaphysical thing, like in how we kind of show up and we build these relationships with each other. The strange piece, I think, is, it's like, what is the ordering and the sequencing of what I do, right? So a lot of people like, do I post on X? I think one of the reasons why so many people naturally gravitate to Discord and forums and stuff like that and start that is because they feel like, oh, well, that's what you do, right? Is I go and create a platform. And then what happens is nothing really happens in that platform. And then they consider it a failure. Like, well, the community doesn't really map to what I'm doing. But in reality, what makes these communities work is it's the facilitation. It's having a person who is the human connector and bringing people together. I'll give you an analogy. Like, I'm sure you in the past have thrown a party at your house, right? And we throw parties at our house. The kind of people who are naturally good at building communities, what they do is when your first set of guests arrive at your house, the community types will bring two people together who don't know each other and try and find the common ground. They'll say, oh, I know you just went to Hawaii recently. Like, where did you go? I went to Maui. Oh, didn't you just go to Maui like last year? Yeah, okay. And then they connect those people. They start talking. Now I can go on and connect other people. For the people who find community stranger or more unusual, it would never even cross their mind to do that. And I think that's where the weirdness lies in it.
So you're saying extroversion is a extremely important factor of community building?
Yes and no, because I struggle with this, like, because so I'm extroverted with people I know, but for me, I hate walking into a room of people I don't know. And most people, when I tell them this, they're like, "Really? You seem like very extroverted." But because I honestly, I think this is part of being a bit British, is that like if I walk up to a group of three people who are having a nice conversation, my big fear is they think, "Well, we were having a great time until this weird English American guy kind of showed up." So I think that I think some of the most incredible community builders that I've met in my career, they're actually what I would describe as an ambivert. They are weirded out and perturbed by groups they don't know, but with groups they do know, they're great. But what they do is they understand the power of like being the facilitator in the group. Like, and to me, it's about lifting people up, right? So a practical example of this is I think webinars suck. It's one person talking to a bunch of people. They're very effective at selling stuff on the internet, certain types of products, but they generally people churn a lot with webinars. If you show up in a group session and you capture an agenda and you have 10 to 15 minutes of training and then you facilitate a conversation between people and you're the person that's connecting these people together, it delivers an amazing experience. That to me is the kind of personality you want. And I think a lot of those people are actually not extroverts in nature, but they're energized by connecting people together in a setting where they feel safe that they can do it because it's the session that they're running, for example.
Yeah, and I've noticed that a lot, especially firsthand. So I know for a fact that, yeah, you're absolutely right. Ambiverts are great at community. Another thing I'm curious about, I don't know if you've ever spoken about this or if this is even like a question you've been asked before, but do you know of any company that was able to beat a competitor? So let's say they have equivalent features or very similar features. They almost feel homogenous, but one was able to succeed over the other just because their community was a moat for them. Both had delightful experiences, both had great onboarding. Product was identical almost, but they one over the other because of a better community.
So I think it depends. This is where it gets into slightly murky territory of like, it depends on how we define community. Like, I think if we define community as part of their strategic focus was in assembling their users together to support and each other in their success, if that's kind of how we're framing a community, I think there are a number of examples of companies that have done this really well. I think GitHub did that. I think to a certain degree, we did that in Ubuntu. Red Hat were more successful from an economic perspective because in the early days of Ubuntu, just the company was not set up for success. It just wasn't selling anything really in the earlier days, which would be completely blunt. But I would also say that Stripe are a good example of that over PayPal. I would say that Figma, Notion were good examples of that. And I think there are many examples in the open source space, right? So the Kubernetes, for example, in the cloud native world has been very successful in, with when it comes to container orchestration. Docker in the earlier days did a good job at that as well. So yeah, and with each of these examples, like that community focus was very much of a strategic piece of it. Vercel are also another good example of that as well.
And would you say that having a part to play in where a product goes is a important characteristic to determine whether the community is going to, be retained for a long period of time or not? Because a lot of teams struggle with like how much access do we want to give our community? Like, is it just around solving pain points for them, solving problems for them, being helpful, or go a level above and say, okay, let's involve them in product development directly? Like, let's allow them to help on tickets, let's help on certain features, testing it out, so on and so forth.
Right.
So would you say that contribution in product is a critical factor for a community's sustained retention
Yeah.
and activation?
That's such a fantastic question. I think it's crucial because the communities that people stick around in and where they really feel part of something is the psychological outcome is a sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging is one driven by the people you spend time with in the community. You enjoy their company. You find the conversations interesting, rewarding, stimulating, but also it's where the community feels malleable. It feels shapeable in different ways. If you join a community and you're basically, there is no way to bend and shape it in different ways, then you feel like you're basically kind of on one of those rides at Disney World that kind of goes through the experience, but you can't veer off in different directions. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not what I would argue is the most satisfying community experience. Where it gets tricky, and there is many examples of failure of this, many of which, including me, are where you give too much control to your audience. So zero control is not an answer. Too much control is not an answer. Because one of the biggest mistakes I think a company can make is where you start designing and building your product for people who are not your ideal customer profile, right? And what tends to happen with communities is everybody has a ton of ideas about what you should build into your product, but they're not necessarily they're not looking at it through the lens that you're looking at, where you have the full scope of how your product operates. They show up with what they want. And 9 times out of 10, what I've learned in my career is when somebody tells you what they want, 9 times out of 10, it's wrong. Like most people don't, this is going to sound really condescending, but I think it's true. Most people don't know what they want, including me, but what they do know what they don't want. So I think if you take the input, the desires and the input about what people don't like, and then you feed it through your product team and your product process, you'll get amazing results. What's crucial is you then tie that back to those original members, right? I've seen so many examples of a company who ships a feature and then they say, these 5 people reached out and they gave us their input, their insight. Thank you to those 5 people because we now have this feature. That to me is the perfect loop, because then you feel like you influence the product, you influence the community.
Yeah. And I always find it a really interesting one, especially now, because a lot of people are thinking about, okay, if we just get buy-in from people, they might just be more interested in the product and using it because they're looking for any tiny advantage that they can get.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and the key thing with this as well is
yeah.
vulnerability. Like, I think when you go out into your community, if a community member says, or a bunch of community members say, you know what, this thing really sucks, it's not good. I think going out there and saying, you know what, you're right, this is not great. Let's have a conversation about how we can make it better. That is so powerful. The problem is that is not the MBA taught mindset that people tend to be like, oh no, we have to have this kind of united. No, 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 no. When you demonstrate vulnerability, it builds that great level of trust.
My final question to you was going to be on, I look at communities as a starting point. So you go from an audience to a community to a cult, right? That's the way, like that's the transition I look at. So for a company that transcends from community to cult status, where there is so much inertia in leaving this community and going to that community, right? I'll almost look at, I think the most popular example would be leaving Apple for Android or Android for Apple, right? So when you are thinking about, should a new product or a competitive product look to build more FOMO or look to build more inertia in their community, which one should they pick?
Definitely FOMO.
So you think FOMO is, let's say, a bigger factor in terms of how communities grow and sustain over inertia?
Well, I think FOMO is it will keep people coming back, but then you need to have a mature operating model for the community to make sure that when they do come back, that it's a good experience. I think it's obviously it's not one or the other, but FOMO is incredibly powerful, right?
But isn't FOMO like spiky? I
Well,
can be interested in something today, not tomorrow.
I don't think it's so much spiky, but I think it matters to a smaller subset of people. So the people who experience FOMO are like people who really, I see a direct one-to-one correlation between the people who experience the FOMO are the kind of people who tend to bring the most value in a community. Because the reason why they've got FOMO is they consider the community to be much more valuable to them in the first place. So therefore, when they show up, they're much more likely to contribute and to share. And that creates a stronger underlying backbone for the community. But, these things are not mutually exclusive. You also then need to have that, there's a retention element to this as well. Like one of the most important metrics to track in a community is churn, right? You want to drive that churn all the way down. And churn in community building is not the same as churn in a product. With a product, it's pure utility is how you value a product. If it doesn't offer you any utility anymore, you churn. In a community,
And how do you stop it from becoming transactional? Because if I'm continuously I'm essentially moving the hamster wheel and people are always chasing the next treat, how do you stop that from either the marginal utility of that going down over a period of time, or that people just start feeling like it's very transactional. Like they give me FOMO, I come back, and then I go, and then I come back. They get tired of it after a certain point.
Yeah, we look at it as kind of like imagine it's like a graph, right? And there's 2 lines in the graph. You've got these spikes at the beginning, right? Those are transactional pieces of value that you get, and you have to have that in the early stages because most people are not tend to be community mindseted, so they're looking for that transactional value. But then what you've got is this slow curve that's going upwards, which is the more human-centric value. It's the networking, it's the friendships that they build. It's that I see my feedback and input into the community manifesting in different ways. I think you need both. In the early stages, those transactional spikes are much more prevalent and much more important. But you need that growth in gradual kind of the weaving in between those. That's how you build the sustainability. If you only have the transactional spikes, to your point, you lose people. If you only have the touchy-feely stuff at the beginning, people are like, for those people who are not naturally attracted to community, like, this is not valuable for me, I'm leaving. Right. So I think you need both.
So immediate value, FOMO, and then long term, you do it good enough, provide enough
Yeah.
value with enough FOMO. That leads to inertia and leaving community. And that's a perfect way to wrap it up. Jono, this was amazing.
It was a huge pleasure. Thank you so much. And by the way, man, you asked great questions. So I appreciate you being so
I'm
thoughtful
glad
in how you interview people. So
glad you enjoyed it. I could challenge the community YouTuber on some community questions you've not been asked before.
yeah,
So
I
this
love
was
it.
fun. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. See you in the next episode. GM, bye bye.